Across the oceans, humans have built communities on islands almost entirely disconnected from the rest of the Earth. Settlements in the middle of the North Atlantic, with no rivers or lakes, forcing every roof to collect rainwater to sustain life. A solitary volcanic island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, featuring giant stone statues towering over thousands of kilometers of open sea. And towns deep in the Arctic where the sun disappears for months. And ice and snow can block every route connecting to the outside world. Yet people do not just survive in those lands, they call them home. Time and time again, they choose to hold their ground on these tiny patches of land in the middle of the ocean, even as isolation and harsh climates constantly push their lives to the limit. And nowhere shows this more clearly than Bermuda, where over 60,000 residents have built one of the most extraordinary communities on a land with almost no resources. Bermuda. In the middle of the North Atlantic, Bermuda is just a strip of land covering about 54 square kilometers, located nearly 1,000 kilometers from the nearest mainland. From above, white-roofed houses cover the hillsides. They interweave with narrow roads and a coastline that has almost no room left for expansion. However, what makes life here unbelievable is not its appearance. Bermuda has absolutely no rivers, lakes, or natural freshwater sources. Therefore, the roof of every house is designed with multiple sloped steps to catch rainwater, which is then guided through a gutter system into a storage tank below. That water serves the daily needs of tens of thousands of residents. Farming area is also incredibly limited, forcing most food, fuel, and building materials to cross the ocean on cargo ships before hitting the shelves. Just a single disruption offshore can quickly affect the supply and drive up the cost of living. Despite having a high standard of living and a modern economy, Bermuda still operates on a fragile balance between its rainwater collection system, supply ships, and human adaptability. Tristan da Cunha. After nearly a week of sailing from Cape Town, the volcanic mass of Tristan da Cunha finally appears before your eyes, peeking over the horizon. Steep cliffs drop straight into the South Atlantic, while the only settlement sits on a narrow plain at the foot of the mountain. This place has no airport. The only way in or out is by a few ships each year. But even when a vessel arrives, massive waves can still prevent passengers and cargo from docking. In Edinburgh of the Seven Seas, over 200 residents live among low houses, pastures, and potato patches surrounded by stone walls to block the wind. They catch rock lobsters, raise cattle, and produce a portion of their own food. The rest, from fuel and medicine to essential supplies, must travel thousands of kilometers from South Africa. When rough seas drag on, goods start to become scarce. Mail, spare parts, and even departures for emergency medical treatment get delayed. In Tristan da Cunha, the ocean is the only connecting route to the outside world. When that path is cut off, more than 200 people have to manage on their own with whatever is left on this isolated land. Curaçao. The brightly colored blocks of Willemstad make Curaçao look like a Caribbean city built right at the water's edge. But once you leave the harbor, the landscape quickly shifts to dry hills, thorny bushes, and cacti stretching out under the sun. On this island of over 150,000 residents, limited rainfall means the water supply cannot rely on natural rivers and lakes. Seawater has to go through desalination plants before flowing into every neighborhood, making electricity and technology an essential part of life. The scarce farmland also means that many types of food, fuel, and consumer goods must pass through the port of Willemstad in containers before being distributed across the island. The ships, pipelines, and factories behind the blue beaches are exactly the system that keeps Curaçao running. The island is not separated from the world by a multi-day journey at sea, but by a more silent limitation. If the import chain or the water production system is disrupted, the modern pace of life here will instantly feel the pressure of an arid land. Marshall Islands. Spread across a massive stretch of the Pacific Ocean, the Marshall Islands are made up of 29 coral atolls and hundreds of small islets surrounding blue lagoons. The mainland, in many places, is just a narrow strip, with houses and roads squeezed between the ocean on one side and the lagoon on the other. The average elevation of this island nation is only about 2 meters. Because of this, seawater can wash through residential areas during high tides, flooding roads and bringing salt into the thin freshwater layer underground. People have to collect rainwater from their roofs, store it in tanks, and use it carefully when the dry season drags on. On heavily populated islands, filtration and desalination systems help supplement the supply, but they still depend on electricity, fuel, and maintenance equipment. Little arable land means that rice, packaged food, building materials, and many necessities have to be transported by ship. For the outer islands, supply trips can be less frequent and easily affected by the weather. Easter Island, rows of Moai statues stand with their backs to the sea, backed by open grasslands, volcanic craters, and hillsides with virtually no large tree cover. That is the familiar landscape of Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, an island spanning about 164 square kilometers located nearly 3,700 kilometers from the South American mainland. Most residents are concentrated around Hangaroa on the western coast. Leaving the settlement, the roads quickly run through wide fields, black rocky shores, and ancient ruins scattered across an almost entirely empty land. The island has no permanent network of rivers or streams. Rainwater quickly seeps through the volcanic bedrock, meaning the water supply has to rely on crater lakes, groundwater, and modern distribution systems. The distance from Chile also makes transportation a crucial part of life. Fuel, equipment, building materials, and many types of goods must travel by ship or plane before reaching the stores on the island. Svalbard. For more than 2 winter months, the sun completely disappears from Longyearbyen. Multicolored houses sit below snow-covered mountain slopes, while streetlights reflect on the ice amid a darkness that lasts all day. Svalbard sits deep in the Arctic Ocean, roughly halfway between Norway and the North Pole. Outside the small settlements are glaciers, fjords, rocky mountains, and snowfields stretching to the horizon. The permafrost means that many structures must be built on stilts to prevent heat from the building from melting the ground below. The roads in Longyearbyen also come to an abrupt end at the edge of town and do not connect to other communities in the archipelago. In winter, snowmobiles become a vital mode of transport to cross the frozen terrain. When the sea opens up in summer, boats take over many routes. To return to the mainland, residents still have to rely on flights through northern Norway. Most food, fuel, and supplies are brought in from the outside, while the weather can alter transport schedules and activities outside of town. St. Helena. From the sea level, St. Helena is almost locked behind a ring of dark brown cliffs rising straight out of the South Atlantic. Only when getting closer does Jamestown appear in a narrow ravine, with bright-colored roofs stretching from the harbor deep between 2 steep slopes. Above the dry cliffs is a completely different landscape. Winding roads go through pastures, green valleys, and hills that are frequently covered by clouds. However, the steep terrain makes flat land rare, and construction and transportation on the island are always complicated. St. Helena used to be accessible only after many days of sailing. An airport operating since 2017 has significantly shortened the journey for passengers, but the few thousand residents on the island still rely heavily on sea transport. Food, Fuel, vehicles, machinery, and building materials are brought in by cargo ships. A delayed delivery can cause goods to become scarce or force projects to keep waiting. Marquesas. In the Marquesas, the coastline rarely opens up with long stretches of sand. Volcanoes plunge straight into the ocean, creating high cliffs, sharp headlands, and deep bays surrounded by mountainsides. Clouds often cling to the high peaks, while waterfalls drop into forest-covered valleys. Small settlements sit close to the mouth of the bays or on the rare flat land between the mountains and the sea. This archipelago is about 1,500 kilometers from Tahiti and only has 6 inhabited islands. The distance between them is covered by open sea, making travel reliant on small planes and boats instead of a continuous transportation network. The locals catch fish, grow coconuts, and plant fruit trees, maintaining a portion of their food source right in the valleys. Even so, fuel, medicine, machinery, and many consumer goods still have to come from Tahiti. Every valley in the Marquesas essentially operates as its own world. When the ship appears outside the bay, that is when the communities nestled behind the cliffs are reconnected with the rest of the Pacific. Tokelau. Looking down from the middle of the Pacific Ocean, Tokelau is pretty much just 3 slender coral rings surrounding lagoons that are far wider than the land where humans can live. Houses, rows of coconut trees, and community structures are clustered on low-lying strips of land, where it only takes a few minutes of walking to reach the shore on the opposite side. The limited land area means farming mainly revolves around coconuts, fruit trees, and some root crops. Fuel, building materials, medicine, and a lot of food still have to be brought in from the outside. Rainwater is collected from roofs and stored in tanks to be used through periods of low rainfall. When dry weather persists, every water tank becomes a vital reserve for the entire family. Faroe Islands. Villages in the Faroe Islands often appear at the end of a fjord, with steep green mountainsides in the back and the North Atlantic constantly changing color under low clouds in the front. The archipelago consists of 18 islands, where waterfalls pour off cliffs, grass-roofed houses cling along the coast, and winding roads disappear into mountain tunnels. Strong winds, rain, and fog can roll in very quickly, making a ferry route, a flight, or a cliffside road difficult to use in just a short amount of time. To connect communities divided by sea and mountains, the Faroes have built a network of bridges, mountain tunnels, and undersea tunnels. Most of the population can now travel between the main islands by car, while the smaller islands still rely on ferries or helicopters. Fishing and aquaculture provide crucial revenue, but many types of food and consumer goods are still transported from the outside. The tunnels have shortened the distance between villages. However, right above them, the clouds, the sea, and the cliffs still continue to dictate how easily this archipelago can be navigated. Greenland. In Greenland, a road might run through an entire settlement and then abruptly end in front of rocky mountains, a bay, or an icy expanse with no way forward. Most towns are scattered along the coast, with multicolored houses facing bays full of icebergs. Behind them are mountains, glaciers, and the inland ice sheet that covers almost the entire center of the island. Between most cities and villages, there are no connecting roads. To get to the next community, people have to use planes, helicopters, or boats, depending on the season and weather conditions. In summer, cargo ships bring containers, fuel, and supplies to coastal ports. During winter, ice, wind, and prolonged darkness can make the journey more complicated, especially for the small settlements in the north and east. A portion of the food is caught right locally, but a lot of vegetables, consumer goods, and equipment still have to travel thousands of kilometers from the outside. Greenland is larger than many countries, but its communities exist as distinct dots on the edge of the ice. The gap between two towns is sometimes measured not in road kilometers, but by a flight or many hours floating at sea. Vanuatu. In Vanuatu, smoke can billow from a volcanic crater, while just a few kilometers away, villages still sit among tropical rainforests, orchards, and blue coasts. This island nation stretches into a long chain across the South Pacific. Many islands have steep terrain, divided by dense jungles, rivers, and coastlines that are difficult for large ships to access. In the remote communities, locals grow yams, cassava, bananas, coconuts, and catchfish to maintain a portion of their food source right on the island. Houses are usually located near orchards or along dirt roads running through the forest. However, medicine, fuel, building materials, and many goods still have to pass through Port Vila or major hubs before being moved onward by small boats and domestic flights. In Vanuatu, an island can provide land, fish, and fruit for its residents. But the stability of life still depends on the sea staying calm, the roads staying open, and the mountain above remaining silent. Islemalk Island. Viewed from the water, Islemalk simply appears as a forest-covered limestone mass, with green cliffs rising up in the southern lagoon of Palau. There are no cities, roads, or permanent communities on this island. Most of the coastline is surrounded by rocks and dense forest, meaning access has to start by boat and then continue via a trail inside the island. Hidden behind the thick tree cover are dozens of marine lakes isolated from the ocean. The most famous is Jellyfish Lake, a saltwater lake connected to the outside sea through cracks and underground tunnels in the limestone. The isolation of the lake has created an environment entirely different from the surrounding lagoon. Swarms of golden jellyfish move across the water, following the light, while the deep water layer has very different conditions and is not suitable for diving. Humans only show up for a short time to research or visit, and then return to Koror. Every trip depends on boats, permits, and the protection of the lake's sensitive ecosystem. Kiribati. Right in the center of the Pacific Ocean, Kiribati spreads across an area of sea so vast that the nation's islands are scattered across 3 archipelagos, while the total land area makes up only a tiny fraction. The majority of the territory consists of low coral atolls, forming narrow strips of land around lagoons. In South Tarawa, houses, roads, and public buildings stretch almost continuously between 2 bodies of water. The low elevation makes arable land scarce, and seawater can easily intrude into the groundwater layer beneath the coral foundation. Domestic water largely comes from rainwater and underground freshwater lenses, both of which depend on rainfall to be replenished. Roofs are connected to storage tanks, while some islands use solar-powered desalination and water supply systems. When the dry season drags on, the water reserves have to be carefully shared among households. Kiribati possesses a gigantic maritime zone, but life is concentrated on strips of land so thin that rainwater, groundwater, and the ocean are always just a few meters apart. Lofoten. The jagged peaks in Lofoten shoot straight up from the Norwegian Sea, creating a stone wall behind fishing villages, white sandy beaches, and red wooden houses sitting right at the water's edge. The archipelago is located above the Arctic Circle, where winter casts darkness over the fjords and summer keeps the light on the horizon almost all night long. Communities that were once separated by mountains and sea are now connected along the E10 route by bridges, tunnels, and roads winding around cliffs. However, on small islands and villages off the main route, ferries and boats still play a vital role. The sea provides the most obvious source of livelihood. Every cod season, fishing boats return to the harbours, while the wooden racks along the villages are completely covered with fish, drying in the cold wind. Although modern transportation has shortened journeys, snow, strong winds, and rough seas can still disrupt ferries, close roads, or make traveling between communities difficult. Nauru. A road trip around Nauru can bring you back to your starting point after just a short ride, because this entire island nation fits neatly onto a small coral island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Along the coast are houses, coconut trees, and a low-lying strip of land wrapping around the island. But step just a bit further inland, and the landscape instantly turns into mining sites, dirt roads, and countless sharp limestone pillars jutting out of the ground. Phosphate was once mined across most of the central area, making many parts difficult to build on or farm. As a result, the population and most daily activities continue to be concentrated on the narrow belt near the shore. Natural water sources are also limited. Households collect rainwater in tanks, while desalinated water helps supplement domestic needs during dry spells. Food, fuel, vehicles, and the majority of consumer goods must arrive by ship. Cargo is transferred from large ships to the island through an offshore system, since Nauru lacks a deep and sheltered natural harbour. Azores. In the middle of the North Atlantic, the 9 islands of the Azores emerge with water-filled craters, green pastures, hydrangea hedges, and cliffs plunging straight into the sea. Each island has its own unique terrain. São Miguel features large lakes set within volcanic calderas. Pico is dominated by a cloud-covered peak. Flores, meanwhile, is draped in waterfalls and dark green slopes. The distance between the islands means life cannot run on a single road network. Airplanes connect the main hubs, while ferries transport people and vehicles across sea routes, especially between neighboring islands. In rural areas, cattle pastures cover the hillsides, providing milk and meat for the local market. Fishing, agriculture, and tourism collectively sustain many communities located far from the European mainland. Even so, many types of fuel, machinery, and consumer goods still have to be shipped from the outside. Fog, heavy winds, or rough seas can cause flights and ferry routes to change on short notice. Tuvalu. On the main island of Funafuti, the airport runway takes up a massive chunk of the narrow land strip and sits right in the middle of residential areas. When there are no flights, this empty space becomes a place for kids to play sports, people to take walks, and families to gather in the evening. Just a few steps from the runway are houses, the lagoon, and the open sea. At certain spots, the land between the two shores is so narrow that the entire nation looks like a green line drawn on the surface of the Pacific. An average elevation of just about 2 meters means seawater can spill onto the land during high tides. Saltwater intrusion affects the groundwater and makes growing vegetables, yams, and other food crops much more difficult. Locals mainly collect rainwater from roofs and then store it in tanks. Some areas plant crops on raised soil beds or use farming methods that help limit the impact of salt. The outer islands are connected to Funafuti by boat, while international cargo and passengers primarily pass through the capital's airport and seaport. Mont Saint-Michel. When the tide goes out, Mont Saint-Michel stands amid an expanse of sand and mud, stretching all the way to the horizon, with small streams winding around the base of its walls. A few hours later, the seawater returns, covering the bay and turning the rocky mount and the abbey on top into a striking island amidst silvery grey waters. The structures are stacked according to the slope of the rock. Houses, shops, and narrow walkways cling around the base of the island, while the abbey reaches up at the highest point above the tiled roofs. For centuries, the tides dictated when people and goods could access this place. Today, an elevated bridge connects Mont Saint-Michel to the mainland, allowing for more steady travel and letting the water flow underneath. Even so, exceptionally high tides can still surround the entire Rocky Mount, erasing the exposed land strip and completely altering the landscape in just a single afternoon. Lanzarote Island. The color green has almost vanished from most of Lanzarote. In its place are black lava fields, reddish-brown volcanic craters, and white houses scattered across a dry land under the Atlantic sun. Little rainfall makes rivers and lakes practically non-existent, and the volcanic rock surface makes farming particularly difficult. On the Lageria fields, locals dig deep holes into the ash, plant grapevines inside, and then build semicircular stone walls to block the wind. The layer of volcanic material helps trap moisture from the air and limits water evaporation. Thanks to this, rows of grapevines can still survive in a landscape that looks nearly impossible to cultivate. The water supply for the towns currently relies heavily on desalination systems. Lanzarote is also where Spain's first seawater desalination plant went into operation in 1964. Hawaii. From the crowded beaches of Oahu to the lava flows on the island of Hawaii, this archipelago shifts constantly between cities, rainforests, sea cliffs, and towering peaks rising above the clouds. Each island is the exposed part of a massive volcanic system rising from the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. The distances between them are large enough that roads cannot form a shared network, making airplanes the primary mode of transport for inter-island journeys. On heavily populated islands, houses and highways can stretch around the coastline. Just a few kilometers inland, the terrain quickly turns into steep mountainsides, dense valleys, or lava fields with practically no structures. Local agriculture provides fish, fruit, vegetables, and some specialty products. However, the majority of goods consumed in Hawaii, from food and fuel to building materials, still have to arrive by sea. Fiji. Over 300 islands of Fiji are scattered across a vast expanse of sea, but most of the population is clustered on just a few large islands. Away from the urban areas, small villages often appear among coconut groves, green mountainsides, and bays that can only be reached by boat. In many communities, yam, cassava, banana, and fruit tree gardens sit right behind the houses. The sea provides fish, while the land helps families self-sustain a portion of their food before the supplies arrive. The distance between the islands makes ships the most crucial transport route. Fuel, medicine, building materials, and consumer goods usually have to pass through major ports before continuing on to the outer islands. A ship failing to dock can directly impact the daily life of an entire community. During typhoon season, heavy rain and strong winds can damage orchards, roads, and piers. After severe storms, restoring the local food supply can drag on even when transportation has been reconnected. Amidst the ocean, ice, volcanoes, and isolation, humans still find a way to build a stable life. Which location impressed you the most? And would you be willing to live long-term on one of these islands? Share your thoughts down in the comments, and don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell to keep exploring other extraordinary places in the world. See you next time.